What if one of the largest cities in human history was never built above ground at all, but hidden beneath the feet of people who had no idea it was there? In this episode, we will explore a series of ancient architectural ruins that defy explanation, and the discoveries discussed here may help us lift the veil on the mystery of prehistoric civilizations. Beneath the rolling landscape of Cappadocia in central Turkey, a secret world lay sleeping in the dark for who knows how long, until a tiny, almost laughable accident pulled back a corner of the curtain. That accident began not with an archaeologist or a grand expedition, but with a few missing chickens that refused to stay in their yard. What kind of civilization leaves behind a metropolis so vast that it can hide behind a missing flock of birds? But this story of vanished chickens in Cappadocia is where our journey into the underground truly begins. Imagine a quiet village home, built on ancient ground, where a local resident notices that, day after day, birds disappear near one particular wall. Following the sound and the movement, they find a crack, then a gap, then an opening that leads not into a storage space or a cellar, but into a breath of cool, stale air from somewhere far below. With a lamp or flashlight in hand, they squeeze through and step onto rough hewn steps carved into the earth, descending into a darkness that feels old, heavy, and expectant. Stay with me until the end, because what we're about to uncover connects dots you likely haven't connected before. Counter to every expectation, what looked like a small animal passage turned out to be the gateway to Derinkuyu underground city, an extraordinary sight that extends an astonishing 84 meters beneath the surface. As explorers and researchers pushed deeper, they realized this was not a simple cave or a few rooms carved into the rock, but an immense, tiered world that could shelter up to 20,000 people. Picture that for a moment. An entire town's worth of families, supplies and daily life not scattered across hillside, but stacked below them in layers of stone. The sheer scale forces us to rethink what we imagine ancient people were capable of planning and building in the remote past. So who first looked at this landscape and decided that an entire city belonged below, not above the ground? Even more astonishing is how organized this hidden world appears when you begin to trace its outlines. Level after level branches into corridors and chambers, some small and intimate, some broad enough to gather many people together, suggesting a complex social life that once pulsed through these hollowed spaces. You and I can almost hear the echo of footsteps, the murmur of voices, the clatter of work reverberating off the rock as generations moved through this buried labyrinth. This is not the chaotic refuge of a few desperate families. It feels like a carefully planned environment, created to sustain a population on an almost unimaginable scale. What kind of knowledge and coordination would it take to design such an astonishing architectural achievement without modern tools or written blueprints? That this discovery raises another, more technical mystery that makes Derinkuyu even more puzzling. The geological conditions in this region in the bedrock can be carved using relatively simple tools, making it, in theory, accessible to determined builders with patience and basic technology. On paper, digging into a rock that can be shaped by hand tools sounds straightforward, something that could be done step by step over time. Yet translating that potential into a multi-level city deep enough to reach 84 meters, large enough for 20,000 inhabitants, is a leap in scale that feels almost impossible without sophisticated planning. So if the stone cooperated, who provided the vision, the labor, and the organization to transform it into a vast underground world? So who were they, these unseen engineers of the deep? Standing in one of these carved corridors today, you would find no obvious inscription proudly naming a king, no carved plaque announcing the date or the people responsible. The builders remain stubbornly anonymous, leaving us with architecture of astonishing scale but almost no narrative to go with it. Researchers may offer theories and rough timelines, but decisive evidence tying this particular network to a known civilization remains tantalizingly out of reach. If we cannot confidently attach a name, a date, or written language to the original construction, what does that say about how much of our past has slipped out of recorded history? The mystery deepens when you realize how much intention seems to be woven into every descent through this city. This was not a random digging spree. It feels like a deliberate response to some powerful need, whether for safety, secrecy, or something we have not yet imagined. Think about the psychological leap required, persuading entire communities that their security, their future, maybe even their identity, belonged not under the open sky, but beneath tons of earth and stone. Families walking down into the ground. Children growing up knowing that the real heart of their world was hidden away, invisible from above. That image alone forces us to reconsider the stories we tell about ancient life. What could drive a population to treat the surface world as something to retreat from rather than inhabit? Researchers may map the tunnels of Derinkuyu in minute detail, but the truly puzzling question remains why an entire city was created underground when building above ground would seem so much easier. Was this an answer to relentless threats from the outside world, or was it tied to beliefs and rituals we can barely guess at from the bare stone? The lack of surviving clues about their motives leaves an eerie silence, as if the most important part of the story was deliberately concealed or erased. We are left reading architecture as if it were a coded message, knowing that our interpretations may only capture a fraction of what the builders intended. Could it be that this silence is itself part of the message, hinting at a catastrophe or purpose so profound it had to be hidden? Everything discovered in Derinkuyu so far may be nearly the tip of the iceberg compared to the civilization that conceived it. If a lost city capable of housing 20,000 people can sleep beneath an ordinary village for ages, how many other secrets remain entombed beneath familiar landscapes, unrecognized and untouched? The vanished chickens that first alerted that homeowner to a hole in the wall now feel like a metaphor for our entire understanding of prehistory. We spot small anomalies, follow them, and find that entire worlds are missing from our story. Derinkuyu forces us to stare into that gap and ask whether our timeline of human civilization is far more incomplete than we like to admit. And as we follow this underground trail further, we will see that Derinkuyu is not an isolated enigma, but the opening chapter of a far larger mystery about hidden cities and the people who carved their lives into the earth. But once Derinkuyu shook the archaeological world, the ground itself seemed to start answering back, and the first reply came from another quiet settlement not far away. Beneath this second community lay Kaymakli underground city, a sprawling subterranean complex with a layout so reminiscent of Derinkuyu that it felt like discovering a twin. Passages, living spaces, living spaces, living spaces, and Younger Dryas again descended in multiple layers, mirroring the same instinct to carve an entire way of life into the rock rather than simply hide a few valuables. What truly deepened the mystery was the reported existence of a tunnel linking Kaymakli directly to Derinkuyu, as if the hidden cities had been designed from the start to function as parts of a single organism. And once you realize these were not isolated refuges but connected hubs, you have to ask, how far does this unseen network really extend beneath the surface we walk on every day? But this discovery of an underground twin raised a troubling new question. Who coordinates the construction of multiple multi-level cities that can physically link to each other? To carve such passages, separated by distance and darkness, implies planners working from a shared mental net, or at least a cultural blueprint that outlived generations. The idea that two entire communities could disappear underground together, still able to move between their cities without seeing the sun, suggests a social structure far more elaborate than random families fleeing danger. If Kaymakli and Derinkuyu formed a pair, then the pattern itself hinted that there might be a whole constellation of hidden settlements governed by the same invisible rules. And if that is true, then every new entrance we find might be a doorway not into a single city, but into a buried civilization minus wide infrastructure. Even more astonishing is that Kaymakli was not the last time researchers would be stunned by the scale and sophistication of what lay beneath people's feet. Another extraordinary sight came to light as Ozkonak underground city, revealing yet another multi-level labyrinth carved into the same ancient rock. This time, the city was reported to extend through 10 distinct levels, stacking human life vertically in a way that feels more like a living machine than a simple shelter. Within these depths, archaeologists identified communication systems built directly into the stone, channels that allowed people on different levels to speak or send signals without ever emerging into daylight. If humans were improvising, they were doing it with such consistent engineering logic that it starts to look less like improvisation. But the presence of communication systems embedded in the walls of Ozkonak forces us to reconsider what these places truly were. Temporary hideouts would not require such complex internal networks. Those are features of settlements expecting to function in the dark for extended periods, where information is as vital as air and water. The vertical layering and deliberate design suggest planners who anticipated conflict, coordination, and the need for rapid response, all without sacrificing the security of remaining concealed. When you place Ozkonak alongside Kaymakli and Derinkuyu, you no longer see three accidents of history, but the outlines of a consistent architectural language spoken underground. And that raises an even more enigmatic question. If this is a language, what kind of society was fluent enough in it to carve entire regions of rock into coordinated, habitable systems? The mystery, however, grew to an astonishing scale in 2012, when yet another subterranean giant began to emerge from beneath the modern landscape. This was Nevsehir underground city, a complex so vast that its estimated area reached an almost unimaginable 460,000 square meters beneath the surface. Imagine underground expanse stretching out like a hidden city district where corridors, rooms, and passageways could potentially run beneath streets, homes, and daily life without anyone knowing for generations. Compared to the earlier finds, Nevsehir felt less like a refuge and more like a buried metropolis, suggesting that underground living may not have been a last resort, but a central pillar of an entire way of life. When one site of this size appears, we can write it off as exceptional, but when it joins a growing list, it starts to look like a deeply rooted cultural pattern. But this pattern that everyone minus of marvel turns out to be part of a repeating phenomenon pushes us into uncomfortable territory. The more we uncover, the less secure our neat timelines and categories of primitive and advanced start to feel, because each new city forces us to admit that earlier models were far too small. We thought we understood how ancient communities responded to danger or hardship, yet here we see layer upon layer of rock shaped into self-contained worlds, planned as though the ground itself were safer than the open air. At some point, the real question stops being about any single site and becomes a challenge to our entire framework for interpreting human prehistory. What do you think is really driving the uncertainty here? Tell me in the comments. Even more astonishing, the ground was not finished rewriting the story, because in 20 another revelation emerged beneath yet another settlement, Midyat underground city. This time, early estimates suggested that the complex might be up to 300% larger than Derinkuyu, transforming what we once viewed as an unparalleled marvel into a relatively modest piece of a much grander puzzle. If Derinkuyu felt like discovering an underground skyscraper, Midyat feels like discovering a buried city miners state, sprawling out in ways that our current maps cannot yet fully visualize. The idea that a structure of this magnitude could remain hidden until so recently, beneath a lived Miocene landscape, hints that our inventory of the ancient world may be far from complete. And if Midyat turns out to be as immense as early assessments indicate, we are forced back to the central question: what kind of threat or vision could doctor humans to build such colossal havens beneath the earth? But this is where a counter-intuitive pivot emerges. Archaeologists can measure rooms, map tunnels, and trace levels, yet the deeper they go, the less certain they become about the people behind them. Tools, pottery, and traces of later occupants may speak to those who used these spaces in recent millennia, yet they may say little about those who first conceived and carved them. It is as if we are walking into a house that has been sublet across ages, trying to guess the original architect from the scuff marks of later tenants. The tension between tangible stone and elusive identity turns each of these underground cities into a kind of riddle posed by the past. And when we realize that this riddle keeps repeating beneath different towns and across great distances, we are left wondering whether we are seeing the fragments of a single vanished civilization, or the convergent response of many cultures to a shared catastrophe. So who were they, these planners of darkness, these engineers of invisible cities who trusted the earth more than the sky? The recurring features, multi-minus level designs, internal communication systems, and interconnecting tunnels suggest that certain architectural ideas were carried forward and replicated, as if from a well-minus, guarded manual never written on paper. Such consistency over such an astonishing scale indicates that we are not looking at random survival tactics, but at a deeply minus-rooted strategy, refined and transmitted over long stretches of time. It's as though the memory of whatever drove people underground never fully faded, surfacing again and again in stone or vanishing from our surviving texts and myths. And this leads to a truly puzzling question: if the underground holds the architectural memory of this strategy, where do we find the story that explains why it was needed? Even more intriguing, when we step back and look at the map of these underground cities together, Derinkuyu, Kaymakli, Ozkonak, Nevsehir, Midyat, we don't see isolated curiosities, but something like the ghost of an entire underground region. We see a recurring decision to invest staggering effort, time, and knowledge into life below rather than above the surface, as though the open world could not be trusted. Everything about this pattern hints at planning on a civilization scale, shared techniques, similar problem minus solving, and an obsession with concealment and continuity. Yet the written record that should accompany such an organized, enduring system is missing, leaving us with stone shells whose original story has been stripped away. And this gap between visible achievement and invisible history sets the stage for a final, haunting question: might other archaeological sites above ground this time hold the missing chapters that explain who these builders were and what they were running from? To search for those missing chapters, we move from the darkness of the tunnels to a windswept hill crowned by stone Gobekli Tepe. Here, massive stone pillars rise from the earth, some arranged in circular formations and densely decorated with enigmatic carvings, and the site has been dated to around 9,600 to 8,200 BC. That means we are looking at an astonishing architectural achievement rooted deep in the remote past, far earlier than many once imagined people could organize work on this scale. The combination of its age, its craftsmanship, and its symbolic complexity forces us to reconsider what kind of minds and memories were at work here. And once we notice how far back this site reaches, we have to ask whether it preserves not just ritual, but the memory of a catastrophe engraved in stone. But this is where the mystery deepened even further. Some of the carvings at Gobekli Tepe have been interpreted as recording a comet impact associated with what is known as the Younger Dryas event. Instead of random animals and abstract symbols, this reading suggests an intentional code, a sky story in stone that may describe a dramatic encounter between Earth and something from the heavens. If that interpretation is even partly correct, the site is not only a place of gathering, but a kind of cosmic archive, preserving the story of a world minus altering shock. The idea that ancient builders could encode the memory of a comet into their most sacred architecture forces us to rethink what kind of knowledge was circulating in that remote era. And if they recorded the moment of impact above ground, what does that imply about how they chose to live on the ground or beneath it? Afterward, researchers may be confident about the dates and the massive size of Gobekli Tepe, but the truly puzzling question remains why such a monumental effort was undertaken at that exact window in time. We see heavy stones quarried, transported, and raised. We see a dense language of animals and abstract forms, but we do not have a written explanation from the builders themselves. Was this a celebration of a new age, a memorial to a lost one, or a warning encoded for distant descendants who might face something similar? The comet minus impact interpretation tells the site directly to a moment of crisis rather than routine life, hinting that Gobekli Tepe may stand with the threshold between a shattered past and a fragile new beginning. And if Gobekli Tepe belongs to a world recovering from catastrophe, could the vast underground cities we explored earlier be another face of the same survival strategy? Even more astonishing is what happens when we place this interpretation side by side with those subterranean labyrinths. In one, the story of a dramatic event in the sky monoliths, in the other, the response to that event may be encoded in rock-cut chambers designed to shield life from a hostile surface. Above ground, the pillars might whisper, "This is what struck us," while below ground, the tunnels answer, "This is how we endured it." In that light, the cities carved under the earth and the megalith rising from it begin to look less like separate mysteries and more like the chapters of a single, hidden narrative about catastrophe and survival. And if these are the surviving chapters, where might we find the mythic prologue that tells the same story in words rather than stone and rock? So who were they in the stories passed down through ancient traditions? In the religious tradition of Zoroastrians, there is a myth of a figure named Yima, who is instructed to build an underground refuge to preserve life from a devastating change in the world above. In this story, a chosen group has gathered and sheltered below the surface while the outside becomes a place of danger, and the refuge is carefully prepared to sustain life until the crisis has passed. The eerie parallel to the multi-level underground cities designed to hide, to protect, and to keep a community functioning out of sight raises troubling questions about whether the myth is echoing a real survival strategy. And when a myth speaks of an underground sanctuary and the earth itself bears the scars of such sanctuaries, is it coincidence or a distant memory crystallized in spiritual language? Researchers may treat the story of Yima as symbolic, but the truly puzzling question is why this symbolism maps so neatly onto a practical, geologic reality beneath our feet. Symbols can take many forms, yet here we find a narrative of going underground in response to a world-threatening episode, and we also find entire underground regions that appear built to ride out some kind of overwhelming danger. One way to read this is that the story came first and people later projected it onto the landscape. But another possibility is that the landscape came first, and the story is what remained after the details of the builders had faded. In that second reading, the myth of Yima would not be fantasy, but a distorted report of how real communities once survived a very real crisis. And if one ancient myth preserves this kind of architectural memory, how many others might be faint reflections of a world that actually existed before the stories were written down? This brings us to the boldest theory hovering over all these clues, that there was a lost civilization existing before the Younger Dryas, a society sophisticated enough in organization and knowledge to conceive of both monumental symbols and large scale refuges. According to this view, what we see at Gobekli Tepe and in the Anatolian underground is not the spontaneous birth of complexity, but the afterimage of a legacy transmitted from an earlier, largely vanished world. A catastrophic event during the Younger Dryas, possibly involving a comet impact, would then be the hinge where that earlier world was fractured, leaving only scattered survivors to carry fragments of its memory forward. Those fragments might take the form of engineering techniques, star-lore, and stories of going underground to escape a time when the surface could no longer sustain ordinary life. And if this theory is even partly right, then what we call the beginning of civilization might actually be a restart on the ruins of something far older. But this is where the debate intensifies, because not everyone accepts the idea of a lost civilization preceding the Younger Dryas. Many researchers argue that the astonishing scale of Gobekli Tepe in the underground cities can be explained by the ingenuity of hunter-gatherer and later societies, without a forgotten advanced culture, pointing out that humans are capable of extraordinary feats of cooperation and creativity even without cities or writing. From that perspective, the comet carvings in the myth of Yima could be powerful stories woven around real events, yet still fully the product of the societies we already know. The absence of decisive evidence, such as recognizable writing, advanced tools, or clear continuity, weakens the lust-minus civilization hypothesis in the eyes of cautious scholars. Yet, even with these objections, the alignment between Sky and Ines stories, underground refuges, and catastrophic timing continues to nag at anyone who looks closely, and when the stones, the tunnels, and the myths all lean in the same direction, how far are we willing to follow where they point? So what picture begins to emerge if we tentatively connect these threads? Above ground, Gobekli Tepe stands as an extraordinary site whose massive pillars and carvings may record a comet impact tied to the Younger Dryas event, preserving the memory of a world-changing blow. Below ground, the sprawling cities hint at a long-term plan for survival, as though someone believed that the safest way to endure an unstable world was to withdraw beneath it in organized, self-contained communities. Between them, the myth of Yin offers a story-shaped bridge, translating raw experience into a narrative about being warned, building a refuge, and waiting out a hostile age. Taken together, they form a pattern that may be the legacy of a lost civilization, or at least of a forgotten chapter in humanity's long struggle with the forces of nature and the cosmos. And if that pattern is real, what else might still be buried in the earth, or hiding in ancient stories, waiting that they are all telling parts of the same astonishing tale? In the end, we are left with stone circles that reach back to 9,600, 8,200 BC, carvings that may speak of a comet, underground labyrinths that could shelter multitudes, and a mythic command to build a refuge beneath the earth. We do not yet know the names of the planners who dreamed in terms of millennia, nor the language in which they first told their children where they were moving below the ground or raising pillars to the sky, but we can sense their presence in the eerie alignment between architecture, astronomy, and myth, as though a faint message were pulsing through time, urging us to pay attention to both the heavens above and the rock below. Whether that message comes from a forgotten civilization or from our own species learning, over and over, how fragile its world can be, it forces us to reconsider what we think we know about the deep past. And as we keep digging, into soil, into stone, and into stories, the most haunting question may be this: how much of our true history is still hidden, waiting to be discovered in the next chamber, the next pillar, or the next ancient